One of Vladimir Putin's closest aides refused to comply with his direct orders on the second day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This refers to Dmitry Kozak, the former deputy head of the Russian presidential administration. According to the New York Times, citing 3 people close to Kozak, Putin instructed his senior aide to formally demand Ukraine's surrender. Kozak reportedly refused, insisting that he did not understand what the Russian leader was trying to achieve with this invasion. As the conversation grew more heated, Kozak told Putin that he was prepared to be arrested or even shot for his refusal to comply. According to sources, it was only later that Kozak learned that in 2022, Putin had put the conversation on speakerphone, turning high-ranking officials of the presidential administration into witnesses of this rare act of defiance. Konstantin Zatulin, a member of parliament from President Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party, who personally knows Dmitry Kozak, described him as someone who remains consistently loyal to Putin. However, he noted that Kozak does not hide his opinions. In the presidential administration, it is not customary to argue with your boss's opinion, Zatulin said. The New York Times notes that Kozak was in fact the only dissenting voice within President Putin's close inner circle. Even before the Russian invasion in early 2022, Kozak was engaged in negotiations with Ukraine about the ongoing war in the eastern part of the country. In January of that same year, he held negotiations in Paris, which sent a very positive signal. Several former Ukrainian and American officials familiar with these confidential talks stated that, in their considered opinion, Putin's aide was genuinely and sincerely seeking a diplomatic solution. Kozak also prepared an extremely detailed and extensive memo, thoroughly outlining the likely negative consequences and ramifications of the war. According to one of those individuals who reportedly saw this important document, it contained a clear and explicit warning about the possible accession of both Sweden and Finland to the NATO alliance. According to several reliable sources, on February 21st, he once again spoke at a formal meeting of the Russian Security Council, and during this address, he stated that the Ukrainians would indeed resist, that anti-Russian sanctions would be particularly severe, and that Russia's overall geopolitical position would likely deteriorate as a result. Some news agencies reported that Kozak made a phone call to Yermak, who was then serving as the head of the Ukrainian president's office, just a few hours after the invasion began, and demanded that Kiev surrender. Kozak himself, however, claims that the situation was actually different. Allegedly, it was Yermak who reportedly called him, and Kozak said that he wanted to achieve a peaceful and lasting settlement through negotiations as quickly as possible. According to 3 sources close to Kozak, as early as the second day of the invasion, he was negotiating a possible ceasefire with another Ukrainian official, David Arakamia. The agreement provided important security guarantees for Ukraine from Russia and called for the withdrawal of troops from all Ukrainian territory except for Crimea and Donbas. These negotiations in particular angered Putin. According to 3 independent sources, on the evening of February 25th, Kozak held a detailed briefing for President Putin via the Kremlin's secure telephone system. During this conversation, Putin sharply lashed out at Kozak for overstepping his official authority by discussing sensitive territorial issues and instructed him to inform Kiev that Russia would only negotiate Ukraine's surrender. Kozak felt that Putin was abruptly changing his negotiating position. He said he could not conduct negotiations if he did not know Russia's ultimate goals. Putin brushed off these concerns and ordered Kozak to negotiate according to his instructions. Kozak refused, the article says. According to multiple sources, it was during this conversation that Kozak told President Putin he was fully prepared to be either arrested or even shot for his refusal. On February 26th, President Putin's position on the matter changed for the second time. In the morning, the first deputy head of the presidential administration, Sergei Kiriyenko, informed Kozak that negotiations with Ukraine on behalf of Russia would now be led by another Kremlin aide, Vladimir Medinsky. After the conflict, Kozak kept his office in the presidential administration, but he also proposed some radical changes within the country, ending the war and carrying out a series of liberal reforms, including most notably establishing an independent judiciary.
Russia has shortened the timeline for preparing for possible aggression against European countries. This was reported by the head of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, Kyrylo Budanov. Moscow could be ready for such actions as early as 2027.
According to the main plan, the Russian Federation was supposed to be ready to begin actions in 2030. Now the plans have been adjusted. They have been revised and the timeline has been shortened to 2027. In order for the empire, as they see themselves, to develop as an empire, you always have to move somewhere to expand your influence and territory. To the north, there is only the Arctic Ocean, and beyond the circle, America. That's not an option because it would be painful. To the east is the Pacific Ocean, and again, America. The answer is the same. To the south, China would be an absolute catastrophe. That leaves only the West, which, in their view, pardon the expression, is gluttonous, sick, weak, and indecisive. Kyrylo Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. With
us on the line, Ivan Timoshko, military expert. Mr. Ivan, we're glad to see you.
Welcome.
Welcome. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Mr. Ivan, so the date announced by the head of the main intelligence directorate is 2027, as the year when Russia could ultimately attack Europe. So please tell us, does this mean that by 2027, Russia needs to resolve its remaining issues, including its invasion of Ukraine? Is this possible at all, both from a material and military standpoint? For example, conducting military operations on two fronts, Ukraine and Europe. For instance, the Baltic countries.
Why are they already fighting on two fronts? According to the extensive Zapad 2025 exercises, this is essentially a comprehensive rehearsal, or let's say, the very first public and significant stage of Russia commencing a full-scale war against the entirety of Europe, and frankly, there is absolutely nothing surprising or unexpected about this particular development, really. After all, we know what Russian propaganda says, right? Everyone around is an enemy. And the biggest enemy is the evil NATO. And when they say NATO, I'm being deliberately ironic here, they actually lump the entire Western world into that term. Moreover, I would add that in fact the greater threats are to the Scandinavians rather than the Baltic countries, although we shouldn't rule them out either. Risk areas. Why? Because everyone has been talking about the Baltic countries for quite a long time. Knowing from the Soviet Union, they considered this direction as, say, potentially a priority for the enemy, so plans, measures, and projects were developed there anyway, in order to somehow counter the Soviet Union and now Russia as well, whereas the Scandinavian countries until recently were essentially neutral and only joined NATO not long ago. But still, we understand that joining NATO doesn't easily change the mentality. Here's what I'm getting at. It's still a mindset of neutrality. We know what internal conflicts there have been in Scandinavia and even in Austria. For example, regarding the introduction of conscription or its restoration or preservation. That's why we understand that Russia considers them. All the more so it considers the Scandinavian countries as simply as territory that stands between them and the US for comprehensive trade. Furthermore, if we talk about threats to Western Europe, we have to understand that Russia is already systematically working against Europe. The appearance of Russian drones on European territory is no coincidence, nor is the increased activity of enemy agents. The sabotage of several enterprises and assassination attempts on influential figures, particularly leaders of the European military-industrial complex. We are also witnessing the destabilization caused by migrant movements and now a significant surge in the activity of leftist groups in European countries. For example, in Germany, students took to the streets with slogans like "Better Putin's occupation than serving in the army." All of this is now being set up to minimize the readiness of European countries to resist at the moment of Russian aggression. The year 2027 will come. I don't know. I believe it has already begun the process of preparation. perhaps the basic phase. That is, by that time, the involvement of conventional troops could potentially be considered. And shouldn't we consider this an invasion? For example, the appearance of Russian border guards at the Narva crossing, which recently came to light. Europe's problem is that they do not see or do not want to see the systematic nature of the approach. Russia. They consider what is happening provocations. Some rather dubious Russian actions, a profound sense of self-delusion, and a strong self-reassurance, like, no, Russia, we are so incredibly serious, so undeniably tough, they absolutely won't attack us. We possess a robust economy, we have significantly more people, and therefore we are safe. In essence, in some ways, they are repeating the mistake Russia made before its aggression against Ukraine. How so? They believe that their budget and population are larger than, say, Russia's, just as Russia believed in relation to us. But we showed our readiness, our people demonstrated a willingness to resist, to fight. Whereas Europeans realize, or perhaps don't realize, that it's unlikely their population will become so militarized in these 3 years that, say, from 15% of men now, that the number of those willing to fight for their Ukraine will grow from 15% to, for example, 70%. Well, we have our doubts. That's why, in reality, it's unlikely that Russia will set any kind of deadline in such timeframes. Especially since we see that they've started covert mobilizations, covert mobilization of conscripts, covert mobilization of so-called reservists. Why do I say so-called? Because everyone who was in the reserve, one way or another, they've already drafted them into the army. Now, this is a covert mobilization. Any Russian they catch under the pretext of verifying information will just happen to turn out to be a reservist and will be drafted. But if they keep increasing and building up the Russian army, it could spark serious unrest among the population. When might this not cause unrest? When the troops are given the chance to have a quick, small, victorious war somewhere and to loot as much as they want. So let's imagine a scenario where these inexperienced soldiers, for example, are sent to Ukraine, while the battle-hardened ones are sent to the Baltic countries. And they'll say, this is your reward for what you did in Ukraine, for your friends, your fellow countrymen, your own people. All of them died in droves in Ukraine. Here's your compensation. Will they need massive forces for this? Well, again, we are perfectly aware that the Russian army is the army of a country at war. And the question is whether even well-armed, technologically trained European countries and their armies will be ready to fight for a long time, even in the medium term. The Russians are also perfectly aware of this. They are ready to die and go to war on broken down equipment, on anything at all. But what about Europeans? That is the real question. It's very difficult to assess because no one can predict the population's response before a war. Not until the war actually begins.
Mr. Ivan, thank you for joining us on the air. Ivan Timochko, military expert, was live with us in the studio.